I'd like to describe to you the ideas of Eliyahu Goldratt, often under the umbrella name theory of constraints, but which I'm going to break down into two different elements, theory of constraints and logical thinking. So what do I describe here? The theory of constraints is anything to do with constraints. That's why I prefer to keep that word. And it's all about having a systemic or global view of an organization, looking for global optimums rather than local optimums and local performance. And it's all based on the idea that you can't have equitably distributed capacities in a system. Somewhere in the system, somebody's got the short straw. It's the constraint of the system surrounded by definition by non-constraints. Okay, and therefore you have a dual view, different rules for constraints versus non-constraints, and you apply the 5 focusing steps in such an environment to increase the overall performance. Another very important aspect that doesn't emerge from the name theory of constraints is everything to do with variability and uncertainty and the placement of buffers in the right places to keep the system under control and maximize performance by protecting it from variability and uncertainty. And finally, the idea that all this should be used to increase performance of the system, to improve the making more money now and in the future by increasing sales more than reducing expenses and costs. And that's the theory of constraints part. So within what I've called the theory of constraints, we're going to have different elements. The first element, historically the first, is everything to do with manufacturing and how you manage operations, and in which you often apply or you often use the word drum buffer rope. Okay? So here we're talking about, of course, the importance of constraints and how you're going to have a focused approach on those constraints to improve performance. And you have a system to manage the flow, which is historically the first one being drum, buffer and rope, and more recently simplified drum, buffer, rope, or SDBR. And as I mentioned, you also apply the 5 focusing steps to improve performance, identifying a bottleneck, improving things until you get a new bottleneck, and so forth. You can see the detailed videos on that subject elsewhere. And so that's the first historical step described in the goal, and it's what the theory of constraints is best known for, right? But there's another important aspect, which is critical chain, project management, everything to do with managing projects. That emerged a little bit later, but it's developed now to be used throughout the world in all kinds of projects, and it's becoming more and more popular from year to year. It's based on the idea that you shouldn't protect the individual tasks in a project, but you should protect the project by having a buffer at the end of the project, and you manage the execution by plotting progress on something called a fever chart, which shows you exactly how you're moving ahead and how much you're consuming your protection in your buffer. And it's a very light tool for managing projects. There's also the critical chain, which is a sequence of events which you need to follow specifically, which is the constraint of an individual project. And there are other elements that are important in there about how you want to prevent bad multitasking in these environments and how you should stagger projects. As I say, the most important decision is when you launch a project and how many projects you have going on simultaneously, because you want to keep the quantity of simultaneous projects down to a minimum to increase flow, to increase performance, to increase efficiency, to increase visibility. The third element is historically within supply chain, managing supply chains, and the solution is in particular to have high frequency periodic replenishment of your systems with more centralized stocking than you would have in a classic system where it's often too distributed according to the point of view of the theory of constraints. And again, you have buffers in the system to protect it against variability and uncertainty in the forecast and demand in particular in this domain. The close cousin of the subject is called DDMRP, Demand-Driven MRP, which emerged more recently and which is heavily inspired from work done by the theory of constraints and is therefore a close cousin of what I've just described. The next element of the theory of constraints is in marketing and sales, and it's I find a very interesting remark by Eliyahu Goldratt. When people talked about not having enough demand for the products of their company, they would say that the constraint was out in the market. And Eliyahu Goldratt said, watch out, before you make that point, before you say that it's the market's fault. Are you sure that your marketing and your sales is up to the job and it is generating enough demand for your products and services? And it's true that I've found in my business that in business-to-business environments in particular, there's not enough marketing and deficiencies in sales, which means that before you can claim that the market's too small and is not saturating your capacities, have a look at your marketing and you can improve it. In there, you've got things like the mafia offer or the unrefusable offer, a very powerful offer that's very convincing to the market. How to develop a decisive competitive edge. How you would look and identify your sales force constraints, because you could have a bottleneck or a constraint in your sales force. And how you would sell products maybe which have the greatest margin viewed by the theory of constraints way, the delta T or delta throughput factor. The next element in these boxes of the theory of constraints is something that's transverse, since it's about throughput accounting or throughput-based decision-making, making decision based on money, and it applies, of course, to any of the domains I've just described. And there is a set of indicators, throughput, inventory and operating expense, which are proposed to be used for decision making. They are nothing specifically new, they're just a reformulation of classic numbers, but the way they're used and described help people to make decisions with the global performance in view rather than local optimums. Okay, and there are other elements in there. A very important element on throughput accounting, which is how you determine your product mix depending on how much money you're going to make with one product A compared to product B, and throughput per constraint unit. And there are other things such as dollar days to look at how you're managing your inventories and that sort of stuff. So that is a whole domain, more recently called Throughput Economics in a recent book on the subject. Okay, and finally, the last box that I'd mention is one which probably you won't find in many descriptions of the theory of constraints, which is the theory of constraints applied in services. We do quite a lot of that. For instance, we've done work with companies like McDonald's in their restaurants using the theory of constraints, and the difference being that you don't want to have a structural bottleneck or capacity constraint in services, because that generates a queue which will mean you're going to lose customers. Okay, so you maintain a system with excess capacity on average, but when you have a peak in demand, a micro rush or whatever, you're going to get a bottleneck that's going to appear momentarily, and that thing has got to be used as a control point to manage the business, the flow and stuff. Okay, and the other thing that happens often in the world of services, whether it's services of products or services are more technical, is that you might be in the world partly between repetitive products and non-repetitive products, and therefore you will have to maybe sometimes choose or combine the solution of operations and the solution of project management in that area. Okay, so those are the elements of the theory of constraints. Let me now talk about logical thinking. It comes under two different names, which are the thinking processes or the logical thinking process. And I know that many people will include this within the theory of constraints. I put it outside just for clarity reasons. That's to say that since there are no constraints in this part of Eliyahu Goldratt's ideas, I think it's better to put it outside. And it's a very important subject, since it's one of the Eliyahu Goldratt's passions, which was to teach the world to think, or to think more logically in particular, right? And so in these thinking processes or logical thinking process, you have a certain number of elements. One of the most well-known is the goal tree, which, as its name implies, enables a company to define the goal it has and how to get there, the necessary conditions and key success factors to get there. But that is the most well-known element. But there are also other elements such as the current reality tree, the future reality tree, the conflict cloud, which can be used for conflict resolution, and another batch of ideas around the strategy and tactics, which serve the same purpose. If I want to implement that strategy, what are the tactics and what are the elements I have to apply? Okay, and it's a very brief description, since I could carry on and talk about categories of legitimate reservations, how to make sure that you're being clear and logical within even a sentence and that sort of stuff. Okay. And I could also add other ideas such as the 6 pillars of the theory of constraints, the change matrix, and the 6 questions about technology, the innovation process, and management skills and so forth and so forth. So there's a lot of stuff in there, but as I say, I put it slightly aside from the theory of constraints, because although it's all fascinating and you'll find a lot of important things in there that guide or explain what happens in the theory of constraints, in that logical thinking there are no constraints, and therefore I put it apart. I call the whole thing Eliyahu Goldratt's ideas, or Goldrattism, okay, with the two sub-elements, theory of constraints and logical thinking. Thank you.